Welcome back to another episode of 3 True Scary Stories with the Spooky Moose. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's begin. I have been living in Philadelphia my entire life. I own a condo downtown near my job, which is great, but sometimes the city life can get hectic. With my work being very demanding, I often like to take small trips on the weekends to destinations not too far from home. One weekend last summer, I decided to take a drive over to the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. I must say, if you haven't been there, it's quite beautiful, with miles of sprawling evergreen forest and scenery that's just to die for. I would not always go on my adventures alone, but in this case, with no one free that weekend, I jumped in my car and took my much-needed trip out of the city. The drive was not far and only took about an hour or so before I was surrounded by dense forest. I had planned to hike a trail or two and grab some nice local grub while I was there. The roads seemed to go on forever as they twisted and turned through the dense flora. I hiked the trails like I had planned, and after, I found the most delicious food at a small old tavern that by the looks of it had been around for years. There weren't many people dining in that evening, just a few locals that seemed to be regulars judging by their friendly relationship with the staff. As I drank my beer, an old fellow and I that sat a few chairs down at the bar top struck up conversation. We spoke of many things, from politics to relationships, but one thing in particular stood out from the rest. As I was paying my tab, the sun was beginning to set. The old patron asked if I would be staying the night in the area. I told him no, and that I would be making the drive home. I assured him that the few drinks I had wouldn't hinder my hour or so drive, but the expression that he wore on his face told me that he advised against it. In the most serious tone, he said, "Have you ever heard of the Jersey Devil?" I couldn't help but to laugh out loud, but the look on his face never changed. I then decided to tell him that I had heard of it, but chalked it up to an old wives' tale. He went into the lore, explaining the origin story and the accounts of local sightings, with the bartender every now and then chiming in, vouching for all that he said. I must say, by the end of his presentation, I was kind of freaked out. He bid me farewell as I walked out of the tavern. The last thing he said was to get home safe and don't stop for anything until I'm out of the Pine Barrens. As I made my way back down the dark, forested roads, where the trees seemed to create a never-ending dark tunnel, I couldn't help but to look over towards the tree line, hoping I didn't see any eyes staring back at me. The first 20 minutes of the trip went by smooth, besides the random deer darting across the road. After a few minutes driving down the back road, I decided to stop and take a leak. Those few beers I drank earlier had ran its course, and I couldn't hold it much longer. I pulled over to the side of the road and ran towards the brush to do my business. Right as the warm feeling of relief was starting to wash over me, I heard clicking behind me. I quickly looked over in that direction, but it was pitch black. It sounded as if a horse was walking towards me, but the rhythm of the steps were off. The steps were slower. That's when the stories the guy told me at the bar flooded my mind. I stood at the rear of my vehicle, peering down the dark road from which I had just traveled. The red taillights on my car cast an ominous glow on the road and the tree line, and that's when I seen it. Something I only can describe as an abomination, not fit for the realm of man. A man-sized creature slowly walked towards me, with the lower half of a goat, a man's mutilated torso, and the head of what I only can describe as some sort of goat man. It seemed to carry the darkness with it, because the red hue of my lights disappeared around the beast. That's when I realized it had wings that were as black as the night. They were fully outstretched. I had become enveloped in a paralyzing fear that still gives me night terrors to this day. The smell of death tainted the air the closer the beast got. I whispered to myself, "The Jersey Devil." At that point, it let out a loud screech, a sound that only could be described as otherworldly. Quickly snapping from my trance, I turned and ran to my car door. I got in and floored the gas pedal, trying to make my escape as quickly as I could. Next thing you know, I was flying down the narrow back road, way faster than what I was comfortable with, but I had to put as much distance between us as I could. I looked out my rearview mirror and yelled when I saw the beast flapping its wings and soaring almost effortlessly, keeping up with my car. Then, with one change in the angle of its wings, he flew upright and out of sight. When I got back into well-lit civilization, I stopped at a Wawa and got out of my car and had a full-blown panic attack. People were looking at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I had just seen some unbelievable stuff with no drugs involved. I kept this story to myself, only telling my mom, who has had many of her own experiences with the unknown. That's until I told it here today. I had a run-in with no other than the New Jersey Devil. The story takes place back when I was 12 on one of our annual family trips to Minnesota. We lived on the East Coast, but my dad's parents lived in northern Minnesota, basically in the middle of nowhere. When they started to get up in age, my dad made it a priority to help them winterize their property every year. They stay on a large chunk of land that's been in my family for a long time. It butts up to a lake where we would fish and take the boat out in the summer. My parents and I would take the long drive halfway across the country to help them do all the chores that they needed done before the snow came. My father was military at the time, so this one year in particular, he couldn't get leave until December, which by that time, the snow had already begun to fall. My grandparents did what they could that year, knowing that we wouldn't be there until the start of winter. So when we arrived, we had our work cut out for us. There was at least 8 inches on the ground at the farm when we got there. After all the hugs and catching up, we went over what needed to be done, then we went to bed. We would have an early start that next morning. My job was to go down to the lake and remove the planks from the dock, which basically just consisted of me pulling up all the wooden planks that went out over the water. With heavy snowfalls and ice, it can easily destroy the wood in one winter season. I had helped my dad and grandpa do this many times before, so I felt confident. I walked about a quarter mile down to the dock carrying my tarp and my drill, and I got to work. The dock went out pretty far onto the lake, and I started by pulling up each plank one by one. It was always so peaceful here. I always enjoyed the stark difference between where we lived in New Jersey and here in Minnesota. My granny served lunch around 1, so after a few hours of working, when I looked at my watch, it was already time to eat. I started to walk back up the path from the lake to the house, and at first everything seemed normal, but I realized something strange. There were footprints in the snow next to mine on the path back to the house. When I walked down to the lake earlier, the path was untouched. I remember thinking how nice the landscape looked and that it was a shame for me to walk through it and ruin it all, so I know those footprints were not there. As I followed them, they stopped about 50 yards from the break in the trees where you can see my grandparents' house in the distance. Then only my footprints went on from there. I was freaked out a little but shook it off, thinking maybe my dad or grandpa walked down the trail a bit to check on me. When I got inside and sat down at the kitchen table, I asked if anyone had walked down the path earlier. I told them what I had saw, and I watched my granddad's face go from normal to concerned. They said that they hadn't and had been doing chores in the barn. My dad told me to stop being paranoid, and when lunch was over, he sent me back down to the lake to finish up. On my walk back, things got even more strange. There were now a few more sets of tracks on the path back to the lake. Giant boot prints, way larger than my dad or grandpa could make. My grandparents' house had faded behind me, and now the snowscape seemed more menacing than ever. I stopped to contemplate whether I should go back or not, and that's when it happened. I was grabbed from behind and lifted off the ground. I looked down to see two giant arms wrapped around me, squeezing me so tight I thought my ribs were going to snap. I kicked and squirmed, but I was nowhere near strong enough to break from the psycho's grasp. He took me off the trail deeper into the forest. Extreme panic took over me, and I screamed out for my dad as loud as I could. I was able to yell for him 2 or 3 times before a giant hand covered my mouth. Time slowed down as I thought I was about to meet my end. And then the sound of a shotgun rang from the direction of my grandparents' property. This scared the crap out of the man because in that moment he dropped me to the ground. I then heard my family yelling out for me. It was like music to my ears. I scrambled to my feet and ran towards the trail, and there they all were, making their way towards me. I briefly went over what happened, but before you know it, my dad had already taken off into the woods where I had just came from, shotgun in hand. My mom and grandma walked me back to the house, and my granddad went off the path to catch up to my father. 2 hours later, they returned with stoic expressions. When my grandmother asked did they find the guy, my granddad just responded with problem solved. I never found out what happened that evening and what problem solved meant, but I do know one thing. With my dad being an active Army Ranger at that time and my grandfather being a retired one, I think that man in the woods may have met a dark fate. I remember when 24-hour gyms started to become really popular. I thought it was a great idea and hurried down to the one that had just opened in my neighborhood and signed up. I was in college at the time, so I felt like it fit in with my hectic schedule. I loved it at first. Working out in the middle of the night became my thing. I would go in around midnight and stay for an hour or two. Then I would finish off my evening in the massage chairs while eating Tootsie Rolls. It was always empty in there around that time, with only a few people working out, but that was usually it. It is safe to say that I was having a blast going to the gym at midnight, but one encounter would make all of that change. I was doing my thing one night as usual when I noticed a guy behind me on the treadmill staring at me while I worked out. I only realized he was there when I felt a weird feeling and looked up to catch him staring at me. Thinking I was overreacting by feeling weird about the situation, I continued my workout. Then when I finished up, I went into the room with the massage chairs like I typically do, to unwind. Within a few minutes' time, that same guy walked into the room with the massage chairs and sat in the chair right next to me. After a few seconds, I felt him looking over at me. I looked over towards him and said hello. He didn't say anything back. He stared at me for a few seconds with a blank expression on his face, and then he turned to look forward again. There was definitely an awkwardness in the air, and after another minute or so, I got up and went to the locker room to get my stuff. I had been there for a while anyway at that point, so I wasn't mad about calling it quits for the night. I usually walked to the gym because it was only a mile from my house, but thank goodness I had decided to drive that night. I left out of the gym keys in hand and couldn't wait to jump in my car and get out of there. I looked in my rearview mirror and seen that guy walking out of the gym, staring at my car as it exited the parking lot. I had to drive straight for about a mile or so until I could make that left turn into my neighborhood. Seconds before I was able to make my left turn, I seen headlights approaching from behind me fast, and I sped up, trying my best to get home as quickly as possible. I took the left turn into my neighborhood so fast I could hear my tires screeching. I had never driven my car like that before, but I did not want to end up as someone's victim. Right when I pulled into my driveway and cut off my lights, the dim glow of headlights could be seen getting closer and closer to my location. Our driveway was extra long and led into a backyard garage. I was parked back there when I seen the car finally ride by slowly, so it seemed like I had lost him. I got out of my car and bolted into the house. It was late and all my roommates were asleep. When I made it to my room, I plopped on the bed, taking a huge sigh of relief. I didn't cut on any lights, and I didn't even think of it for that matter. I lie there thinking about what just happened and if I would ever even return to the gym at night again. All of a sudden, a flash of light came through my curtains. I snuck over to the window and peeped out. It was that same car creeping down the street slowly. I grabbed the binoculars that I kept by my window for bird watching and peeped into the car. I seen the blank gaze of the creep from the gym still looking around for my car. I stayed low so he could not see me in my window. If I had come in the room and cut my light on, he may have figured out where I lived. I watched him through my binoculars as he slowly drove off down the street. I sat in my window for the next 30 minutes, and when he didn't come back, I finally went back over to my bed and laid down. It was hard to fall asleep that night, and when I finally did, I had a dream that I was being chased by that guy. The next day when I woke up, I reported the incident to the gym and canceled my membership. When I told my roommates about what happened, they were horrified. I decided to just use the gym on campus. It was free, and I never had any encounters like that there. This all happened about 15 years ago, and now I live on the other side of the country. I have since gotten over the situation, and it now has just become a scary story that I tell to friends when the topic presents itself. But to all the ladies out there, and guys, watch your back, because you never know who may be lurking with bad intentions. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of 3 True Scary Stories told by the Spooky Moose. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And I'll see you back here again next week.